Welcome, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Goldstein, President of the Municipal Art Society. Thank you for joining us for this virtual gallery talk on Maureen Drennan's The Irresistible Pull, the latest exhibit on view at the MAS's virtual Doris C. and Alan J. Freedman Gallery. Before we begin, I'd like to direct your attention to the chat, where MAS staff will place some helpful hints, including information about closed captioning for today's program. If you need any assistance during the program, please feel free to message MAS using the chat function. And throughout the event, we also invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions about Maureen's work. We will answer those questions throughout the event, plus at the end of the program. The Irresistible Pull explores Brooklyn and Queens industrial waterfronts. Maureen's lens reveals the soul of these neighborhoods, often dismissed as off the beaten path, yet integral to the tapestry of New York City. The show invites exploration into the magical forces that bind people to a place and that draw individuals to often overlooked neighborhoods. These photographs in this exhibit are so full of life and narrative. And today I can't wait to hear the stories behind the images and enjoy the conversation between Maureen and fellow photographer Susanna Ray. First, Maureen will share some of her photographs and background, and then Susanna will join her for a discussion of Maureen's work. Towards the end of the program, they will take your questions. Now I'm excited to introduce the two artists. First, Maureen. Maureen is a photographer based and born in New York City. Her work has been included in exhibitions at the Museum of the City of New York, the National Portrait Gallery, Tacoma Art Museum, the Rhode Island School of Design Museum, JFK's Terminal 4, Aperture, Philadelphia Photo Art Center, Colorado Photography Art Center, the Santoto Gallery, Transmitter Gallery, and Mrs. Gallery. Her images have been featured in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the California Sunday Magazine, the Atlantic, Huntington Post, Photography Magazine, Photo District News, Art 21 Magazine, and on and on. She teaches, I don't know how she finds time amongst that, at the LaGuardia Community College in New York City. And now I'm also thrilled to introduce our moderator, Susanna Ray. Susanna works on long form photographic projects, exploring New York's public spaces, how public spaces offer opportunities for escape, leisure, and transcendence. Many of her projects have occurred at the intersection of city and water, describing how New Yorkers' lives have been shaped by water that ring the city. She has also had solo exhibitions at Baxter Street, the Bronx Museum of the Arts, Ben Ruby Gallery. Susanna Ray has 2 monograms, and her work has been featured by publications like the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the British Journal of Photography. She received her MFA from the School of Visual Arts and her BA from Princeton University. So I'm so excited to have you take it away, Maureen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maureen, and I am so thrilled to be here and to be exhibiting at the Municipal Art Society in the virtual Freedman Gallery. It's just such an honor to be included in this incredible New York organization. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for reaching out to me and for all your guidance and support in putting this exhibit together, and the support of your team, Jen and Genevieve. And thank you so much, Susanna Ray, for moderating later. I love our conversations, both in public and private, about photography. And thank you, everyone, for being here, for sharing your lunch break with us. So first off, I should have asked, can you see me? Can you hear me? The connection is good? Everything's, I guess you can't really reply. Yes. Okay, great. Excellent. Okay. All right. So Jen, okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for screen sharing. So I am from Manhattan. I'm born and raised here in New York City. And I believe it's because of that that I find myself attracted to photographing small worlds and communities that are off the beaten path, because it's so different than what I'm accustomed to, probably what most of us are accustomed to living here in New York City. I'm curious about the people who live in these small communities, their connections to each other, and their connection to the environment. And these are ideas that have been throughout most of my projects. So the Irresistible Pull exhibition intertwines two photo projects. One is called Island Kingdom, which delves into Broad Channel, Queens, and the other is called the Rust Belt of New York, which explores the industrial waterfronts of Brooklyn and Queens. And with the guidance of Municipal Art Society and Elizabeth, I was able to bring together these two projects and see through lines in this work, and merge them and blend them. And I think Susanna and I will probably get into that more later. But so I'm going to talk about the two projects. I'll start out with Broad Channel, and my insights on these projects are based on my own experience. Okay, so for those of you who aren't acquainted with Broad Channel, you should go, because it's this very incredible community in New York City. It's an island. It's in Jamaica Bay. It's in Queens. It's one of the lowest lying areas in New York City. And I had been making pictures of surfers in the Rockaways. So I was taking the A train, and from the window, I would see these houses on stilts, and I thought, well, that's pretty different. So in the summer of 2012, I got off the train and started walking around and photographing. And I was kind of instantly smitten with this beautiful place, with this community, a total anomaly, very different from the rest of New York. It feels like a small fishing village. People, they swim off their docks, they fish. Many people have small boats. And it's wild in some places. It's kind of overgrown, and there's this mix of the natural features and then the city, which makes the area so particularly distinctive. And it's an oasis with these glorious water views. It's small. It's only, it's narrow. It's about a mile long. There were about 3,000 people who lived there before Hurricane Sandy. Sadly, now 2,500, because many were displaced after that storm. Many of the residents are civil servants or emergency workers, and some families have been there for generations. There's 47% of adults, this is from the New York Times article, 47% of adults who grew up in Broad Channel still reside in the neighborhood, which is kind of amazing to me, because I certainly don't reside in the neighborhood I grew up in, and most people I know, most New Yorkers don't. And this is one of the highest resident rates of any neighborhood in the city, one of the highest resident rates. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So these images portray an island community that's defined and enriched by the water. Its proximity to the ocean makes it particularly vulnerable to storms, tides, changing weather patterns. And I began photographing there right before Hurricane Sandy, which then imbued the project with this unforeseen levels of significance. Flooding from the storm devastated the community, and some people lost their homes and everything they owned. And it's not just storms that cause the area to flood. Some streets flood every single time there's a full moon in the summer. So people learn to live with it. They move their cars. They don't park on that street. They wear high boots. Children are given high boots at a very young age so they can make their way into their, to their house, to the stairs, and go up. Broad Channel has the highest proportion of repeated flood-related insurance claims as of 2018. And a huge part of my photographic process is relying on serendipity and the kindness of strangers. And my projects would not exist without the generosity and openness of people. And when I think about it, from their point of view, and this goes for all my projects, it's quite remarkable, actually, because, New Yorkers are guarded for good reason. They are naturally, I'd say, like cautious group. And here I am, a perfect stranger. I have a camera and I approach them. They're on their porch or they're in their yard or they're walking, and I stop and talk with them. And I want to hear their story and I want to make their photo. And of course, some people are not interested and they just say no, and that's fine. I am not interested in forcing a dynamic. I want there to be a collaborative experience because I'm interested in getting to know them. And so I want there to be this intimate encounter. So the people who do say yes to being photographed, I mean, I'm always just really happy about it, and just struck by their willingness and their openness, and also that kind of vulnerability. So I learn a lot from the people that I photograph, and I've spent time in people's homes, in the boat clubs that are in Broad Channel, in the bars, particularly the VFW. That seems to be an epicenter of the community. I've attended families' first communion, Easter parties, different family events. So I try to spend a lot of time with the people I'm photographing. And often it's people's vulnerability as well as resilience and strength that really resonate with me. And I'm drawn to them. I want to talk to them, photograph them, hear their story. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the history of Broad Channel, it's fascinating. It has this very rich history of being resistant to change. So you can see the train there in the distance. So you really get a sense of how kind of wild and overgrown this space is. So the residents refused to accept prohibition laws in the 1920s, and there weren't any roads connecting Broad Channel to the rest of the city. It was too remote for police raids. So it became a haven for rum runners and boat clubs, and it was this notorious night spot. But one of the most impressive demonstrations of resistance was against Robert Moses. So Moses had ambitious plans for Jamaica Bay. He wanted it to become a wildlife refuge, and that would have meant depopulating Broad Channel. So the residents fought and they won. And so they ended up keeping their homes, which is fantastic. He still ended up creating the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge, which is extraordinary also. If you've never been, it really is a beautiful place. It's hard to believe you're in New York City. So it surrounds the community. So in that way, the natural environment is preserved, but the residents got to keep their homes. They did not have to leave. And Broad Channel was devastated by Hurricane Sandy. And so directly afterwards, the media was saturated with pictures of destruction. There were boats up on streets, stuff like that. And I took a few of those pictures because you can't not make those pictures. It's too startling not to, visually document. But I never include them in this project. And because it's pictures you saw over and over, for one, in the media, and it's also sensationalized. But I wasn't interested in the destruction. I tried to make more subtle pictures. There's a picture of a penciled line on a door, which marks how high the storm surge was, or a freshly spackled wall behind a dining room table in this woman Lauren's house. She's a resident of Broad Channel. And her home was being rebuilt. So the destruction wasn't interesting to me. What was interesting to me was the resilience of the small community. Can you go to the next slide? And the Hurricane Sandy, and also watching them struggle to come back to normal, it really drove home the paradox of living close to the water. And the residents of Broad Channel are enriched by the water. It defines them, but it might ultimately be the thing that forces them to leave, because the water keeps rising, and you can only go back so much. And the title Island Kingdom, I found this so there's a public library in Broad Channel, and I've done a bit of digging in there. They have photos and different things out, and some history, of course. And so it's a phrase. I don't know. I don't know if it was necessarily like official, but it was a phrase that people used to call, the residents used to call it. They used to call it Island Kingdom, and I love that because it kind of references this kind of like a magical place, and a place that's it's quite separate from every place else, and it really does, you get a sense of that you're on an island. Well, first of all, the light is kind of extraordinary. Susanna Ray definitely knows, as a wonderful photographer herself, the light there is amazing because you're on an island. So there's all this sort of reflected light happening. So that's how I came to the title Island Kingdom for this community broad channel. But this project is an example of the delicate balance between human lives and environments, especially because it's a balance that's getting more and more unsteady as the effects of climate change affect the way humans and communities live everywhere. It's not just in Broad Channel. It's one story, but it's exemplary of a larger phenomenon. Okay, I'm going to segue now into the Rust Belt of New York project. So if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide, great, thank you. So these next 6 are from that project. So the Rust Belt of New York, let's see. So Broad Channel, I've been working on for a really long time, and that's kind of what I normally do. I work on projects for a very long time. So I started that one in 2012, and I started to wrap up before COVID, but then I went back a little bit. It's hard to not go back. This is maybe something also Susanna and I can touch on, but I have trouble ending projects because it means, I won't go out there regularly and I won't see the people. And it feels like in a way, a door is closing, which feels kind of sad. I suppose there's, you can look at it in a positive way as well, but I definitely like to continue projects. It's hard to stop. So that project has been going on for a long time, but the Rust Belt project was a pretty fast one for me. So I started it right after the 2016 election. So the summer of 2017, and I only photographed it for about 2 years or something. So after the 2016 election, I was talking with another photographer friend of mine, John O'Rotman. For those of you who don't know him, he's a great photographer. He's a great photo editor. And he's from the Rust Belt. He's from Pennsylvania. And so we were talking about how manufacturing and blue collar workers in the Midwest and the Rust Belt were in the spotlight due to their influence in the national election. And so I thought it might be intriguing to photographically explore the manufacturing and industrial areas of New York City, viewing them as a miniature reflection of the broader Rust Belt of the Midwest. And manufacturing industries were once vital and significant, but like manufacturing in the Midwest, they have fallen into decline. And because of the prices in New York of housing, particularly, regrettably, being part of the working class in New York City, particularly manufacturing, often means experiencing marginalization. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So I explored neighborhoods along the waterways in Brooklyn and Queens, and they defy a standard definition and narrative. Some of these neighborhoods are kind of like forgotten parts of New York. I hugged the waterways of the Gowanus Canal, Newtown Creek, Sunset Park, Bath Beach, Gerritsen Beach, Marine Park. And I was particularly conscious of not making the kinds of photos that you normally see of New York when your friends who aren't from here see pictures from New York in the media, in movies. No pictures of skyscrapers, no pictures that we typically see of New York, because really that's only like a slice of New York, and all of these other areas are actually, land-wise much larger, right? And there's a lot of people who live in Brooklyn and Queens. So I was mindful of that. And but I also find that you have ideas about a project, But when you go out and photograph, things start to change. Like I thought many of these areas would be dominated by buildings, large, manufacturing plants or old rundown companies. But actually, the primacy of nature is what stood out to me. There was this kind of sensual aspect to the landscape. There were trees everywhere, flowers and abandoned lots. I mean, it was, and you could always hear the buzzing of insects. So it kind of felt like you were enveloped in nature in this way. Can you go to the next slide? So literature has had a significant influence on my photography. I actually forgot to talk about it for Broad Channel, but I can also talk about it in the chat or whenever. So literature often has a significant influence on my photography. And usually it's something that dovetails where I'm reading something and I'm photographing, and then it kind of comes together. Or I start photographing and I think, oh, I should really explore, so-and-so. And with Broad Channel, I was thinking about Winesburg, Ohio, which is a very old book, but it's really excellent. And now I'm forgetting the author, but anyway, so for the Rust Belt of New York project, I was thinking about Joseph Mitchell. So he was a New Yorker writer. He wrote there. He worked there for a very long time, 1938 to 1996. And he was a really fascinating guy, Joseph Mitchell, because he was from the South. He moved to the city and he was a reporter. And so his editor told him, get to know New York City, walk every single block, get to know everything. And so he did. He walked all over the city. He got to know every quirk, every character. So he was a reporter, but he wrote like a novelist. So when you're reading his work, there's this fiction kind of element to how he wrote. And so he did this, walking and talking to people. He did this obsessively for his entire life. And the writer, Evan Overby, described him as, quote, an excavator of lost souls and eccentric visionaries. His genius lay partly in a natural ability to connect with people. And I was it just really struck me. I was so inspired by the way he would meet and talk with so many people with this mixture of intention and serendipity, because you never know who you're going to meet or what they're going to tell you. So while I was photographing these old industrial and manufacturing areas in Brooklyn, I met and listened to a multitude of New Yorkers. And of course, since I was doing it sort of after the election and I was thinking about the election, I asked people, who did you vote for? How are you? What are you thinking? And no one was interested in discussing politics. They wanted to talk about their families and their jobs. I mean, they totally opened up. But it was so interesting. Can we go to the next slide, please? So now this photo, this is a good example of the serendipity that happens. And this is why been in love with photography for about a little bit under 20 years now, when it came into my life, because when I leave the apartment with my camera, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know who I'm going to meet, what I'm going to see, what I'm going to photograph. I mean, I might have some general idea, like, all right, I'm going to Broad Channel today, or I'm going to go walk around Marine Park, but I could never imagine ahead of time what's going to happen. And so, I mean, sometimes that works to my detriment. Like if it's raining really hard, people aren't out and about during COVID, that's difficult. And there are some photographers, and I have a lot of respect for them, who can beautifully orchestrate a scene. They do it in the studio or they do it out in the world. But that's not the kind of photographer I am. I truly rely on the kindness of strangers and the serendipity, because the things that happen, I could never predict. Okay, so I'm walking through Marine Park. That's where this photo was taken. And there are a bunch of actresses dressed in white, and they have flowers in their hair, and they're making a movie. It's like a low budget movie. And I just was so struck because they looked like these Greek goddesses kind of emerging out of this park that was mostly empty. And they were sort of surprised at me too, like, what are you doing? And so we started talking, and I photographed them. And I love the interaction. I never know what's going to happen, what people will share. And so it's this intimate encounter. And so I completely rely on the found moment. Can you go to the next slide, please? So while intentionally wandering and photographing, it felt like these old manufacturing areas, these quiet neighborhoods and forgotten areas, and the people in them were like a backbone of New York, even though they're not in the spotlight. I think I over talked a little, so there's one more slide. Could you go to the next one? Thank you so much. But I'm finished with my portion. And I'm really excited to speak with Susanna Ray because she is an incredible photographer. And thank you so much for joining us, Susanna.
Hi, Maureen. I'm so excited to be here. Maureen and I have had these kind of artistic conversations before, both in public, as she mentioned, at Baxter Street Camera Club of New York, and then also on the phone. We have the gift of gab with each other, so I'm excited for our conversation. And thank you to MAS for hosting this event as well as Maureen's beautiful exhibition. And as we're going through, if anyone has questions, maybe you want to know about Maureen's process, her camera that she uses, there's no question that's not a good question, and I'm going to keep an eye on the Q&A, so feel free to throw anything you're curious about in there, and if I can integrate it to our conversation, I will, or we'll come back to it at the end. So Maureen, before we jump into a conversation about the online exhibition and your work, I was hoping you could share just a little bit about how you became a photographer. We went to the same graduate school, but we were about 10 years apart. I was there before you. Even though we're about the same age. So your journey to becoming a photographic artist looks a little bit different than mine. And I was hoping you could share with the audience how that happened for you.
Sure. Yeah, I would be happy to. So I was in my late 20s, early 30s. I was sort of casting about. I graduated from SUNY New Paltz with a degree in sociology. I majored in sociology, which, it totally tracks, right? Like the stuff that I'm interested in, it makes sense. But so I had a lot of different jobs. I was a bike messenger. I was a bartender. I was a waitress. I did a lot of things. But I felt like I needed more security financially. So I went to library school to be a librarian, and then to get a master's of library science, which I did get, but I ended up specializing in photographic archives. And the reason was I was working on scanning and cataloging these mugshot photos from the 1940s. And so I imagine they were taken with a 4x5 camera in the 1940s. So the photos themselves were incredibly detailed and intense and very beautiful. And I was just really struck by them, very, very intrigued by them. But it was also incredibly sad because everybody looked rough. Whatever they had done, the crime or the night before, this was their mugshot. And so I was archiving them. So all I had was the photo and the name and then the item number. So I was scanning, cataloging. And I was really struck by the fact that these people were having their photos made and against their will, it was it's part of the, process when you get arrested. And I was deeply struck by what is their story? We don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure somewhere in the archives there's their story, but I was just struck by their lack of agency and the mystery shrouding them. And so I realized, I really want to be I want to be on the other end of this, not scanning and cataloging, but making the images, talking to people. And so that was kind of it. And so I ended up working in archives. I worked at a few archives in New York. And I took classes at night and weekends. And I actually took classes at LaGuardia Community College because they have a lot of classes that are available to adults, which is wonderful. So I quickly fell in love with the medium and the way I was able to interact with the world as a photographer, because I've always been like a very chatty person, a very open person. I'll talk to people. I was talking to people before I had a camera also, or people would talk to me. So it changed my whole life. I'm so grateful that I came to photography when I did, because I wasn't a spring chicken. I was a summer chicken. I was like, 35 when I went to grad school. I went to grad school at School of Visual Arts. I was like 37 or 36, something like that. And so so yeah, that's how I came to it. And then after I got my master's, LaGuardia Community College hired me back as a professor, as an adjunct, and then professor. So
yeah, so interesting, Maureen, because I think, like I went to graduate school almost right out of college. I taught for 1 year. I taught at a boarding school in Northwest New Jersey, and then quickly hightailed it out of there and went to SVA. And then when I finished my graduate work, I think I did a lot of fumbling around as a photographer. And I feel like you did your fumbling around maybe before you went to school. So once you finished your MFA, I feel like you were sort of off and running without having to figure out some of, people kind of arrive where they arrive at the right time. And the other thing that was interesting to me that you touched upon was with these mugshots, you're really looking at these people in maybe the worst moment of their lives.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In this moment of coercion, and they seem to stand almost in opposition to the way that you work, which is through collaboration, via conversation, consent. And then also the one thing that you kept, though, I think maybe you could talk about this, is you talked about the sense of the mugshots being shrouded in mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And you really are left to invent a narrative for the people in those kind of photos. And I do think that there's a sense of mystery in your photographs as well, where you're not supplying all of the information. They're not photojournalistic where everything is being spelled out, because it's got to really illustrate an event in an article. So can you talk about that idea of mystery in your photographs? Do you see that? And if you do, what do you think it offers the viewer?
Yeah, I love that. I'm thrilled that you see that, because one of my favorite photographers is Walker Evans. And I really like what he said. I mean, I have a lot of really photographers who I like a lot, but he was one of the first that really that kind of hit me. That you can invent your own narrative. How did he put it? He was such a slippery fish, right? He said, I photograph in a documentary fashion, right?
So he said in a documentary style, which is a very evasive, slippery, as you said. He wasn't committing to telling the truth.
Right. He wasn't committed to telling the truth. But I also, I sort of love that, because it leaves the image up to the viewer. There's a lot of room for your own story or their own experience of it. And I definitely want that. I don't want to be literal. I don't want it to be sort of lock, stock, and like, okay, this is what it means. I would love for the images to sit with people, and to, maybe the person will think of something else entirely and go someplace else when they look at the picture. And so I try to lean a lot more. I mean, I don't have any poetry background, but I try to lean more into poetry than photojournalistic, for sure.
I started writing down some of the symbolic elements that crop up, like in the photo that's taken outside a house in Broad Channel. There's a frame with this image, this faded large photographic print that has slipped out of the frame, been water damaged. And there's two figures sort of striding off into the sunset. So there's this idyllic life that's being described in that particular image, which I think is the life that when you live in a place like Broad Channel, that's the life that you're trying to describe for yourself. And yet it's a very vulnerable way to live because of particularly because of climate change, as well as I think one of the notions behind your work, this idea of the Rust Belt and these smaller marginalized communities, is that the things that sustain them are a bit endangered.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if that was something that you thought about, whether it's sort of civil service jobs,
Yeah.
Manual labor jobs, the cost of living, the transition of the New York City waterfront into maybe condo land, or, now in Industry City, as they call it now, there's, Restoration Hardware and West Elm or not Restoration Hardware, excuse me, ABC Outlet.
Yes.
Like a lot of high-end things that are encroaching upon this space. And even in, not so much in Broad Channel, but certainly in the Rockaways, there's been a lot of development post-Hurricane Sandy. So you've got like these multiple threats sort of edging in on these communities.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that was just beautifully. I mean, you really eloquently put it, that what defines them is the thing that is going to hurt them. If it's the water or their jobs or their livelihood, and it's deeply sad, but New York has always been this place of change, and it's just constantly changing, which is why I was so struck by the longest resident rate of Broad Channel, because no one I know lives in their neighborhood. Everyone has moved because they can't afford their neighborhood, even if they grew up in New York. I mean, some people, but many people have moved. Yeah, so no, I think about that. I think about that stuff a lot, the sort of the fragility and the vulnerability, and how it's important to document it, but to also give it sort of space to breathe. And I'm like I said before, I'm not interested in telling this. I'm not giving like an authoritative documentary, like this is Broad Channel. It's like, this is Broad Channel from my point of view. These are these waterfront areas from my perspective, my experience.
Yeah, and as you were going through the slides, I was jotting down questions, so I'm going a little bit away from some of the conversation topics we had discussed. So
yeah, that's totally.
I'm putting it on the spot, but
no. It's great.
And I have some good questions coming in their chat as well.
Okay, and feel free to ask me more if I end up going off on a tangent myself.
Yeah. So with Broad Channel, and I think this question extends to all of the work that you're showing, but I'll just start with there, which is Broad Channel. So for the audience, I live in Rockaway Beach. I've lived there for about 20 years now, and even in those terms, I'm not considered a local. Like, I wasn't born there. And if you think Rockaway localism is like heavy, then Broad Channel, it's really other level. Like, if my daughter had a babysitter when she was an infant, that she would go to her house in Broad Channel. Every time I parked my car on the babysitter street, everyone would look out their doors to see who it was.
Yeah.
And then be watching me, even though I came twice a week. So there was clearly this insular community that is very hyper aware of outsiders. And I think at times there have been some negative occurrences in Broad Channel because of that, as well as in other nearby neighborhoods like Howard Beach, things that have made the press. And I don't want to go into that, but that is a hard community to crack.
Yes. And
you have all of your charms, you have your big Yenta energy. But that being said, I have spent years, walking up and down the beaches of the Rockaways, or riding ferries and talking to people, doing a process very similar to you in terms of making work. But I can't ever say that I would try to do that in Broad Channel. So what I would like to know is, did you know what you were getting into, number one? And number two, how did you, how'd you get in? Because that's a really difficult community to get into.
Thank you I love that big Yenta energy. That's amazing. I wonder if that's available on a license plate I could get or something. Well, okay, so I love that question. And I was lucky to have this work featured in the New York Times a couple of years after Hurricane Sandy. And the writer who contacted me was Corey Kilgannon.
Yeah.
And he's wonderful. And he asked the same thing. He was like, how did you? And he's a bit like Joseph Mitchell himself. He knows all the neighborhoods. He knows a lot of people. He reminds me of Joseph Mitchell. So he said the exact same thing. And so the community was a tough nut to crack. I had no idea what I was going into, and maybe that's for the best. I did not know how deeply insular they were. And this is also the serendipity part. I was on my way to photographing the surfers, and I was like, hey, look at that, going on the train. And I just got off the train and started walking around. And usually I just start talking with people. And I met this one guy named Mayor Al. He's not the mayor, but he calls himself the mayor. And he started talking to me, and we started walking around together. And then he was like, hey, this is so-and-so. And so that was just this, he was like this angel who descended. I mean, I could not have planned that or anything. I mean, part of what I try to do is go in the warm weather when people are out and about, late in the day when people are out and about, and then I'll go to the community centers. And this is true in the Rust Belt of New York too. I'll go to the VFWs, go to the bars, go to areas where I see people spending time, and just kind of walk in like, hey, how are you? And I always have the camera on me so they know what's coming. And sometimes I get a lot of pushback, like people are rude or mean. But, for that, as many times as that happens, there's 10 more people who want their photo made or who want to talk. Mm-hmm. So yeah, with Broad Channel, I did not know how insular they were, but I think, it's listening to people. People want to tell you stuff. People end up, I know we've talked about this. Some people treat me like their priest, because the past is this long shadow. It follows you around, and everybody knows your past, but not me. I'm a total stranger. And so there's like this no judgment. I'm just coming to them clean. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that also, again, is a corrective to what you saw in the mugshots, where people could not determine their self-presentation.
Yeah.
But in the portraits that you've made, I think the people are, for the most part, maybe with the ferry photo being the exception, where the man's hand is out, that's more of like a moment. But in the portraits, people seem to be really determining how they appear in front of the camera.
Absolutely. And if you looked at the contact sheets, there's a lot before and after.
Yeah.
And so like with the woman on the truck, so she's a sex worker. And that was another one of those surprising things where, of course, there's going to be people who are operating under the law because they're in a zone which is manufacturing. So there's no police, or very few. There's no families, so no one's calling the police on them. So they can also operate and do their thing, and not be worried about being arrested, or not as worried as if you were in a residential neighborhood. And there were a bunch of women, and they all scattered. They were like, no camera for me. But she was like, I don't care. So we chatted for a long time. And I went back and looked for her. I have her phone number. Of course, I could never get a hold of her again. I mean, I regret that, because she's living a life on the edge. But it would have been nice to give her prints. And so that's something that opens people up. So if they're a little bit reluctant, but we still talk and make the photo, I'll make a small print. I have like a lot of them here to give to people, later this week. When I show up with the prints, it's like a game changer. Sometimes people cry. I get hugs, because they're just so delighted to have like an 8x10 of themselves, or even a small 5x7. And so there's this now they have a picture of themselves. And especially after Hurricane Sandy, people were really wanting photos because a lot of the photos were destroyed. So there's this other element of like giving back to them because they're giving so much to me. So I feel bad that I was never able to connect with her again, the CC, but it's sort of, it makes sense for what she does,
I also think that marks a significant difference between those two bodies of work, because it's really with the photographs for Island Kingdom and Broad Channel where you're going back over and over again. And it's this deepening relationship that then, for them to see how they're being depicted, that only, continues and fosters that relationship. Whereas the process for Rust Belt of New York, which is a lot closer to the way that I've worked, which is like kind of a hit and run. I don't know if that's maybe not the best term, or I used to call it speed dating when I was talking about the way that I would work, where like you have these serendipitous encounters, you quickly engage the people, you connect, you make a photo, and then you've got to move on. And you're unlikely to re-encounter them. Even in my head, I'm thinking of photos that weren't in the exhibition. Like there's that little boy wearing the yarmulke sitting on the bench. Like you're not going to find him again.
No.
The people on the ferry, you're not going to find them again. So that's a really marked, that's a difference in the way of working. So that comes to a question that I had talked about before with you. And then I want to turn to the Q&A because there's some really good questions that have come in, which is blending those two bodies of work. And you use this idea of this through line, but you didn't really follow up on that thought. So what was the challenge of blending the two bodies of work, finding the through line? And then as a third part I want to add in is the title of the exhibition, because I think that the title, The Irresistible Pull, might be a big clue in how you manage to tie very successfully two separate bodies of work together. And that's, you were asked to do something that I think as an artist can be really hard, which is to reconsider your work.
Yes.
Like one wants to dig one's heels in and say, no, that's not how it was conceived, but you did it. So can you talk about how that went for you, and then maybe how the title factors in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Suzanne. I really appreciate that because, I'm such a big fan of your work and what you do and your images. So I'm thrilled that you think it was so successful. I was at first reticent to blend the projects because I thought, well, this is this and this is that, and that's how it is. But so I made little prints, spread everything out, dining room table, big table, and realized, they aren't so different because there are these through lines, and you hit upon the water being the thing that defines people, but it might be the thing that hurts them. And then being in a blue collar worker in New York is not sustainable anymore. And so there's this quote from I think it's Mark Twain, that I love, that I think about with these two projects, which is the only project worth writing about, I guess for him, but for me, it'd be photographing, is the human heart in conflict with itself. Mm-hmm. And I just, so I thought about that, and I was thinking about how I interact with people, and then the areas themselves, these kind of, they're not in the public eye. You don't see them when you see media pictures of New York. I mean, Broad Channel's never, and definitely the manufacturing areas along the water aren't as well. So I thought, well, these are all kind of these sort of overlooked places, but they're actually backbone places of the city. And so when I started moving the images around physically and putting them together, I was like, oh, this is going to be great. This is wonderful. So it was actually like an incredible challenge. And I'm so glad that I didn't, kind of dig my heels in, even though that was totally my initial reaction. And then the Irresistible Pull, I was thinking about tides. And then, the irresistible pull of tides, but then also the irresistible pull of how I'm drawn to people and attracted to people, and then who chooses to be photographed. Because, keep in mind, this is a self-selecting group. This is not everybody. I get a lot of no's you know. And so they are also curious about me. They're like, sure, I'll invite this stranger into my home. I mean, imagine doing that. You know, it takes a lot of courage, but also like willing to be vulnerable. So it's both ends, this pull. So that's how I came up with that.
Yeah. Well, I got a little chill when you said the pull of the tides. I thought that was really wonderful, as well as the back and forth kind of attraction or draw of connecting.
Yeah.
And I'm a huge Walt Whitman fan, as I think you know. And
yes.
You know, I've never read a writer who uses more exclamation points to describe what he's excited about, ranging from, you know, a seagull to a blacksmith on the street. And I think that you have a lot of that energy, which is just this total enthusiasm for seeing people as who they are and in the place that they are. So with that, I want to go over to the Q&A where we have just a little bit of time. So we're going to do a speed round, Maureen.
Okay.
Get ready.
Okay.
The first question is, you have to do 1 minute answers.
Okay.
As a New Yorker, are there other New York-based photographers from the past or present who have inspired you?
Oh my goodness.
You said Whitman, I mean, not Whitman, you said Walker Evans, who did a bit of a tour in New York.
Yeah, certainly Helen Levitt, Susanna Ray. I knew about Susanna's work. I was a fan of her work before we met. Oh boy, now I'm gonna have trouble. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Her Amy, I think Touchette. She photographs. Yes. How do you pronounce her last name?
That's right. Yeah, Amy Touchette. Yep.
Yeah, she's wonderful. Oh boy, John O'Rotman. He's wonderful too.
Lewis Hine, maybe? Can I throw that out?
Yes, of course. Yes. Jacob Reese, Lewis Hine. Yeah, absolutely.
The Photo League, right? All of the Photo League from
League. I mean, Vivian Meyer, you know, she's much more like in your face. I don't think she hung out and talked with people, but I admire her. She was quite bold.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's a hard question. It's hard to like come up with names straight away.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine.
The next question comes from Bob, and it says, please describe your camera. There's so much history in New York City. I find cemeteries are very rich in past history. Currently living in Omaha, Nebraska, but born and raised in East New York and Mill Basin when younger. So born and bred New Yorker, now in the Midwest, and he's wanting to know about your camera.
Yes. Oh my gosh. And you grew up in a great area too. I mean, so it's a Mamiya 7. So I don't have it. I mean, it's packed away, but it's a medium format camera. So it's pretty big. So I use it because of the negatives are large. They're like this big, 6x7. And then so I can make large prints and I don't lose detail, but also having that size camera, it either attracts people or it repels people because people see you and they're like, some people are like, get away from me. I'm like, that's fine. I wasn't talking to you. I was just walking. But, and then some people are like, what's that? So that the medium format camera really helps a lot in that way.
Thanks, Maureen. Okay. The city's redevelopment is making the waterfront a very different place. Are you interested in these communities because of their relative isolation? I think you kind of answered that one already, but is there anything you want to add on to that idea?
I mean, absolutely. I am more interested in the isolation or the difference than the rest of New York. Yeah. Does that, I hope I'm answering everyone's questions sufficiently. Okay. And then the last question that's in the chat, and then I have one follow-up one from me that I think will close us out. So Jean writes, there are so many photographers in New York City. I'm one. Have you found that doing this type of work has gotten harder and with people becoming less open over time? And she also added wonderful work. Oh, thank you. That's wonderful. I would love to see people's work. If you put your email, your websites in the chat too, I'd love to check out your work. I haven't yet. I thought that I thought the 2016 election would kind of change things a lot for me, but so far, so good. I haven't noticed any higher level of like animosity or unwillingness to talk. And I think it's, a lot of it is my approach. I mean, because there are a lot of other photographers who walk around broad channel and photograph, because I meet people and they're like, oh yeah, there was someone here last week and there was someone here, so we're all photographing like all the time, and I'm sure there's like other wonderful projects on broad channel. So I haven't noticed anything yet. I hope that doesn't happen, but of course, sometimes people aren't into it. Sometimes for a little, I've been doing this kind of just to keep my chops up. I ride the Staten Island ferry. And so that's a 20-minute ferry ride. So I get 20 minutes to meet somebody and then have them accommodate me in making a portrait and then say goodbye. And then they say goodbye. And then that's it. So that's kind of like exercising my, talking to people and making a photograph of them. And then of course I always email them the photo later.
Okay. So the last thing I just hoped you could touch on, and then I know that I think Elizabeth will be joining us to close us out. I was reading the Municipal Art Society's mission on their website, and I'm going to read, this is a quote from them. The Municipal Art Society of New York lifts up the voices of the people in the debates that shape New York's built environment and leads the way toward a more livable city from sidewalk to skyline. I think this mission really dovetails with your ethos as a photographer, and I'm wondering if you can close out our conversation with talking about how your work explores this idea of a livable city.
I love that, and I was really moved. I'm moved that you think that, because that ethos is extraordinary. I think. I mean, we all are living here together, right? No matter what our political affiliation is. So I think I'm very curious about people, meeting them, hearing their story, photographing them, and it doesn't matter to me what their political affiliation is. They're often, I'm not in agreement. I mean, that's actually more often that we do not agree, but that is fine. It doesn't have to be paramount, in the relationship. Also, I mean, these neighborhoods that are kind of off the beaten path are so integral to New York. I mean, it's, when you get out there at the edges of all the subway lines, there's a photographer, I forgot his name. He did a project at the ends of all the subway.
Actually, it was a woman. It was a woman. Yes, I forget her name also, but okay. Yeah, the book came out last year, I think.
Okay, yeah, you'll have to tell me who she is. I don't know her name, but it's such a wonderful idea, and that it's like, basically, this is part of New York too. It's not just Times Square, and it's not just the financial district. There's all these stories that make up the fabric of the city. So I'm not so sure how I can contribute to making a livable city, or how the work can. I mean, maybe it's just showing others how others live, then that this exists, and that's, it's even if you might not agree in some ways, it's part of New York, and this is where we're all at together.
Yeah, I think you're illuminating this complex tapestry, it's sort of hand in hand with many other photographers, whether it's myself or I think his last name is Rothenberg, the one who's photographed, the planes flying over that neighborhood in Long Island City, right, and the subway station there. Yeah. Thomas Holton, who's now, going to be showing at Baxter Street his photography of the lambs in Chinatown. So all these wonderful photographers, contemporary and past, who are teasing out these different stories in New York City, so that as a composite, we get a fuller picture than just, the classic picture of the Chrysler Building or the crush of Midtown traffic.
Right, exactly. I love that, illuminating the tapestry. You are so eloquent, Susanna.
I try. It's on a Thursday. I'm pulling it together.
And Thomas Holton, he's wonderful. For those of you, look at Thomas Holton's work. He is fantastic. He's been photographing this family in Chinatown for 15 years or something. Yeah, he's extraordinary. And then, the family has changed and evolved over time. And
yeah, it's another durational kind of series. So with that, we are actually over time. So we're going to close it out and turn it back over to Elizabeth. Maureen, what a beautiful exhibition. I hope everyone who attended today has had a chance to look through the work. If you haven't, it's a wonderful sort of economical presentation of what is best about Maureen as a human and a photographer. And thank you for having me here today.
Oh, Susanna, thank you so much for this. This was so fun.
Yes, thank you both. This was really a fantastic conversation. And, I've looked at these Maureen's photographs a lot, as you can imagine, as we were talking about this exhibition. And, it always amazes me what I see as I look again. And, the level of details and, to your point, Susanna, a little bit of signaling and symbolism in these photographs is just, they're very, very rich. And I really do urge people to go back and look at them again. And I really appreciate this conversation. I was struck by the fact that as you were talking about the irresistible pull, I was thinking about the irresistible pull of time in New York and change, because that too is another sort of, it's not overt in your photographs, but it's sort of implicit in them, that this change is yanking at these places as well. So I want to thank everyone who was able to join us here today. I want to thank the staff of MAS for pulling together another great program, and especially for those of you who are MAS members. If you are not a member and you enjoyed today's program, we hope that you will consider joining. Your membership today helps not only support MAS's programs, but also our advocacy towards that more livable city. See the chat for more ways in which you can support MAS. On August 14th, if you are in town, we hope you'll join us in person at the Housing Works bookstore for a conversation with writer Kevin Baker, who is discussing his most recent publication about New York City's baseball history. What better time to do that than in the middle of August in New York City? The conversation will be moderated by Darren Strauss, and you will also find the RSVP information in the chat. Please stay tuned for other details of upcoming programs happening later this summer. And thank you to Maureen and Susanna again, and all of you for joining us. This was a very fun way to spend our lunch hours. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.